Hi everybody, I'm Barry, and I'm the tech lead for Baloo in Melbourne. Obviously we're running a bit ahead of schedule tonight, and Vlas can't make it, so I decided to expand my talk a little bit, and with the World Cup starting tomorrow, I want to talk about the visual design of the World Cup through the years. Starting with Uruguay in 1930, we'll start with the logo there. Actually, I'm going to jump ahead to my favorite logo, which is this one from Mexico, 1986. I love this logo, it's absolutely classic. Yeah, nah. I'm not going to do that. I thought that was about as far as I could push that joke. So I'll get back to the real thing. I actually want to talk about code coverage and a tool that I wrote to help interpret code coverage. So I'll go back to the start and kind of assume that no one really knows what code coverage is. So what is code coverage? Basically, ultimately code coverage is just a percentage that shows how much of your code is covered by tests. It's a useful metric to show that your tests are covering the right parts of your code, assuming you're writing tests. And it's useful to keep an eye on it to make sure the number is not falling. If you're refactoring code, things like that. It's just another tool in your toolbox. It's not it's not a thing to be worshipped. It's not a thing to pay too much attention to, but it is a useful metric. So why do we report on this? Well, like I said, just for you to keep an eye on your code, make sure you're testing the right things. Sometimes management cares about this stuff, which was the current situation that I was in, which prompted me to write this script. But it's easy to look at code coverage and say I've got one number in mind that I want my code to be, 80% covered by tests or whatever. And I don't think that's all that useful, just as one gross number. You sort of need to dig a little bit deeper and dig into the particular areas of the code base that you want covered. Also, it's really easy to do, so you may as well. So what does it look like? In Xcode, in Xcode, it can show you code paths that you haven't tested. So, for example, here you can see that it shows in red on the right-hand side that there's an else clause here that hasn't been tested, and an exception that hasn't been tested. Sorry about the old style Xcode there. This is actually from Apple's documentation. And also in Xcode, you get built-in reporting, which shows you coverage at file and function levels, but it's not very structured. It just shows you can sort this report by percentage or by file name, which is fine if you don't have a lot of files. That might be okay, but it doesn't really give you any further view of how those files are grouped. So how do you do this? You can use Fastlane. There's a thing called XCOV in Fastlane that will output nice reports in HTML format, which is basically a nicer version of the way Xcode reports it. It's just by file and percentages. XCOV actually will also ping Slack if you want it to, and it'll integrate with Danger, things like that. So that might be useful to you if you're in a world where you use that stuff. There are others. There's Slather, Xcode coverage, and XCCOV as well. And definitely Slather can integrate with other things. I'm not sure about the other ones. Slather looks like that. Again, similar sort of thing, files and percentages. And since Xcode 7, Xcode has had the reporting built in that we saw a couple of slides ago. And again, that might be all you need. That might be fine. I'm going to digress just for a second. I found a quirk a couple of weeks ago that confused me for a few days, which now seems really silly in hindsight, but just in case you get confused by this as well. And I don't expect you to read this code. But basically, I had a bunch of tests running on a class, or a struct actually, but it wasn't appearing in the code coverage reports at all. There was nothing. And this confused me because I'm like, okay, they've got some tests on here. Why is it not telling me I've got tests? So you might be able to see here that this is just a really simple codable structure. It's, what is it, two properties. And the reason it wasn't appearing in the coverage report was because there's no logic in it at all. Or rather, all the logic in it is implicit. It's getters and setters, and its decoding logic is all now implicit in the definition. So I thought, I'll test that, put a bit of logic in, and suddenly it appears in the code coverage reports. But that kind of made me think, well, should I be tested? Like, do I need to test that? Or are the tests even valid for it? Like, I think they are, because I want to check that the JSON decoding of things works correctly. But if it's not appearing in the reporting, it's kind of a little bit strange to write these tests and not have any visibility of when they're failing. So that was a bit strange, and I felt really silly after, like, literally, like, I think Simon can remember this when I found out what it was. I was like, oh yeah, that's such an obvious thing to happen. So you might get caught by that. That's one drawback of Xcode. Another drawback is, like I alluded to earlier, the files, the report that you get from Xcode just shows you a list of files and percentages, and that's it. You can't really do much more with that. So in Xcode 9.3, which was about 6 months ago, I think it was January that came out, Apple gave us a way to export data from code coverage files so that we can do further analysis on it. And it's called XCCOV, which, yes, there was already an open source project called XCCOV. It's not related, it just happens that Apple took the name. And this does just work. Like, it works really well, actually. It's a really good little tool. And basically what it does is it takes the Xcode coverage report that Xcode generates, and it translates it into either text or JSON. And as Jesse was saying earlier, obviously we had WWDC last week. So Xcode 10 possibly gave us some new things. I got really excited when I saw this. Well, you know, a little bit excited. You can build your own automation on top of Xcode coverage reports, according to this talk at WWDC. But there was nothing in the talk that was like that. So I'm not really sure what that was referring to or what it was talking about. And so I pinged Chris Miles and said, do you know what's going on here? He hadn't heard of anything either, so I don't really know where that came from. There was some stuff in there to do with changes to how you generate the code coverage reports, but nothing about what happens after that. So as far as I can tell, there's nothing really new in Xcode 10 in terms of code coverage. There is some nice things in terms of testing, like you can group tests and you can run tests in random orders and things like that are quite cool, but not specifically to do with coverage. So essentially it's the Xcode 9.3 stuff that I'm looking at here. Okay, so how do we do this? Switch it on, checkbox at the bottom there for code coverage. You check that and you select whether you want to cover all your targets or just one target. In this case, just I selected one target. Run your tests. Every time you run tests, it generates a code coverage report. It generates a report only for the things that were in the test run. So if you run your test for one file, your code coverage report will only cover that one file. It's just something to be aware of if you've like disabled tests for your target. After your test run, you can see your tests have passed or failed in the, what's that one called? Report Navigator, I think, in Xcode. And then you go down one level on there and you get the coverage report that we saw earlier. So that's how you do it in Xcode. And like I say, that generates a code coverage report file and a code coverage archive file or folder, I'm not sure, which looks like this, the file, which is cool. Yeah, not very readable, which is why Apple invented XCCOV. Well, why Apple produced XCCOV. So that interprets the XCCOV report file. Bit of a mouthful. And like I said earlier, it gives you two views, which are both readable views. So the text view will output text for you. And essentially, it's just the same stuff that you get through the Xcode report. Got two of those, and then a JSON view. But we can work with JSON, so we can script on top of that. It can also do a couple of other things. It can give you a listing of all the files that are covered by, or covered in the report, and you can dig into an individual file and look at things by function, which is where the XCCOV archive comes into it. this is how you run it. You xcrun xccov, tell it you want to view, you give it where the code coverage file lives, which is usually derived data, but you can make it appear in different places, and you tell it if you want JSON or text, which is cool, but it's still not exactly what I wanted. So what I really wanted was code coverage data that was in a more simple to understand format, so sort of give me stats that I could put on management reporting on a weekly basis. So I actually take these stats and put them into a spreadsheet each week, and then they can be used in management reporting for the current client that I'm at. I only want stats for the parts of the app that I care about, which maybe sounds a bit strange. I don't care about test coverage for the whole app in my current project. I care about my models, view models, care about those a lot. Helpers and extensions, so things like, if I've got helpers on an array, I want to make sure it's not running off the end of the array, things like that. But I don't care about the view layer stuff really, because I've got a QA team taking care of that. And at my current client, I don't care about Objective-C. So currently, we're taking out an Objective-C project, translating it to Swift, and deleting all the Objective-C code. None of it's tested, and we're not going to write tests to cover the code because it's going to be deleted anyway. So I don't care about all that stuff, and obviously that's the bulk of the project. So if I just lumped all of it together and had one overall number for the test coverage of the whole project, because there's so much Objective-C, coverage would be at like 5, 6, 7%. And it's never really going to move that much. So the number looks bad, and it's not all that useful and meaningful. So that was why I wanted to get a more useful set of numbers out of this. And I wanted it to be automated and repeatable so I could do it every week. So I thought I'll write a script, which parses that JSON. So what does it do? First of all, it builds the project using Xcode build. I don't know if you can read that, but basically you give it a workspace and a scheme to run. It builds your Xcode project, generates the coverage file, then it reads the coverage file and interprets it. While it's doing the interpretation sort of phase of it, it prints out a bunch of files that it's worried about. So there's a criteria for this is if it's a model or a view model and coverage is less than, I think it's 80%, then it'll print out on this list. And then it does some aggregation. It takes the stats, smushes them together to tell you your code coverage for the project, for the app, and by file type, in this case, Objective-C, Swift, or other. And then at the end, it shows me the stats that I'm really interested in. So it groups it by model, view model, helper, other, things like that. So the code's on GitHub. If you want to have a look at the code, it'll be pretty easy to change the logic to the specifics of the project that you're working with. So obviously this is really quite heavily dependent on the setup in the current project and the naming conventions and the files and things like that, which will become more obvious in a second when I show you how it works. Now again, I don't expect you to read this. This is just to show you the kind of structure of the thing. It basically has a bunch of helpers for running shell commands, a bunch of model objects, well, 3 model objects for the different types of file or area that the app produces, and has an app file, which is essentially the script that runs you through the process. Lots of files there. That's because it was one script. It was just a big long Swift script, and then after Rob's talk last month, I decided to stick it into Swift Package Manager just to give that a try. And it was pretty good. It was pretty easy. This is how it works. It takes the JSON. It just uses decodable to interpret that JSON. This is the target structure. The project structure is similar. The file structure is basically identical to this, except it doesn't have an array of files in it. After it's decoded it, it runs through some logic, it filters some things down, and then it tries to allocate the architectural areas, which is what we saw at the final set of stats. So it breaks these down using file names. And this is the part that would be really specific to your project. So if you wanted to run this on your project, you'd have to, or you might have to change these to make sense for your naming conventions. For the current project, it looks for things called model, and it looks for view model first, and then it looks for model, and classifies files appropriately. Now, all of our files are not called model, so we don't have a thing called like user model, but the user model is in a directory called model, and this runs on the full path name, so it'll pick that up. So that's how it classifies the different files, and then it takes all that information at a file level, puts it into this, which is essentially sort of a view model that takes so the analysis type is like project, file, or target, which is used for the first set of summaries. The file type is either Swift or Objective-C or other, and the architectural area is the view model, things like that. And then an array of these structures is used to spit out the stats at the end. So it's pretty simple. Like, it's a really simple little script that runs over your JSON. Obviously, it outputs just a text like that. So some next steps might be to output this as HTML to allow some customization to pick different areas that you want to focus on. And if you want more details on it, you can get it on GitHub. Bad's got on there. And that's it. So a quick talk. Any questions? I don't know, I haven't looked at that. Yeah, no idea. Sorry. But yeah, there's nothing automated. No. I haven't seen anything that's using the XCCOV for that. Got a feeling Slather does something like that.
Yeah, right.
Maybe.
There's a couple of tools to turn it into, is it called Euro? I can't remember the name of it. Yeah, they'll turn that into, so that they can call the Java tools can import it to whatever.
Yeah, I think you've been able to, like, people have written tools to interpret Xcode's code coverage reporting for a while, but they were delving into the sort of the binary file format, and this just gives them an easier way to do that, I think.
Any more questions, guys?
How long do we able to hook up to the Internet of Things devices into each developer's desk to give them a bit of a shock when they try to build it out where it goes down rather than up?
I like your thinking. Yeah. Yeah, go into Wednesday. Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Right.